The scream that tore through the Arizona night in 1878 came from a burning homestead 3 miles outside Coolidge, and Lucas Prescott heard it even over the thundering hooves of his horse as he rode back from checking fence lines on the adjacent ranch. Smoke billowed black against the star-filled sky, and without hesitation, he urged his stallion into a full gallop toward the flames that painted the desert landscape in hellish orange light. The heat hit him before he even dismounted, singeing his face as he leaped from his horse and ran toward the collapsing structure where he could hear someone crying out in pain and terror. He found her in what remained of the barn, pinned beneath a fallen beam that had trapped her leg while flames licked closer with each passing second. Her dress was already smoking in places, and Lucas could see burns covering her exposed skin as he grabbed the beam with both hands and heaved with every ounce of strength he possessed. The wood was hot enough to blister his palms, but he ignored the pain and lifted until she could drag herself free. Without pausing to ask questions, he scooped her into his arms and ran through the inferno, shielding her body with his own as burning debris rained down around them. Outside, he laid her on the ground far enough from the fire to be safe, and finally got his first real look at her face. She was young, probably around 20 years old, with dark hair matted with soot and ash. Her green eyes were wide with shock and pain as she stared up at him, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Her arms, her neck, her face, all showed angry red burns that would surely scar, and her dress was torn and charred in multiple places. "My parents," she choked out, trying to sit up despite her obvious agony. "They were inside the house." Lucas looked toward the main structure, which was now completely engulfed in flames, the roof having already caved in. His heart sank as he realized there was no way anyone inside could have survived. He turned back to the young woman, his jaw tight with the horrible truth he would have to tell her. "I am sorry," he said quietly, his voice rough with smoke and emotion. "There is nothing I can do for them now, but I can help you. Let me get you to the doctor in town." She shook her head violently, tears streaming down her soot-stained cheeks. "No, no, they cannot be gone. Please, you have to try to find them." Lucas knelt beside her and placed a gentle hand on her shoulder, feeling her trembling beneath his touch. "Miss, the whole house has collapsed. If they were inside, they would not have felt any pain. It would have been quick." He hated himself for the lie, but sometimes mercy demanded less than perfect honesty. "Right now, I need to get you medical attention before infection sets in with those burns." She seemed to deflate then, all the fight going out of her as the reality of her situation crashed down upon her consciousness. She nodded mutely, fresh tears carving clean tracks through the ash on her face. Lucas lifted her as carefully as he could and settled her on his horse before mounting behind her. She leaned back against his chest, and he could feel her whole body shaking with silent sobs as they rode toward Coolidge under a sky that had turned gray with smoke and approaching dawn. The doctor, an elderly man named Thompson who had seen more than his share of frontier tragedies, worked on her burns for hours while Lucas waited in the front room of the small medical office. When Thompson finally emerged, wiping his hands on a cloth, his expression was grave but not hopeless. "She will live, but those burns are extensive," the doctor said quietly. "They are going to scar badly, especially the ones on her arms and shoulders. I have done what I can to clean and dress the wounds, but nature will have to do the rest of the healing. She is asking for you." Lucas stood and moved toward the back room where she lay on a narrow bed, bandages covering much of her visible skin. Her eyes found his immediately, and he saw a mixture of gratitude and despair in their green depths. "Thank you for saving my life," she whispered. "I have not even told you my name. Catherine Andrews. Lucas Prescott, he replied, pulling a chair close to her bedside. Do you have any other family in the area? Anyone I can send word to? Catherine shook her head slowly. My parents were all I had. We came out here from Missouri 2 years ago trying to start fresh after my father lost his business. We were finally making the homestead work, and now... Her voice broke and she turned her face away from him. What happened? Lucas asked gently. How did the fire start? I do not know, Catherine said, her voice barely audible. I woke up to smoke and flames. I tried to get to my parents' room, but the hallway was already engulfed. I ran to the barn thinking maybe I could ride for help, but a beam fell and trapped me. If you had not come... She did not finish the sentence. Lucas spent the night in a chair by her bed, refusing to leave despite her protests that he must have his own life to return to. The truth was that he did have responsibilities on the ranch where he worked as a foreman, but something about Catherine's situation touched him deeply. Perhaps it was the terrible randomness of the tragedy, or perhaps it was the strength he saw in her, even through her grief and pain. Whatever the reason, he felt compelled to stay. Over the next few weeks, as Catherine healed slowly in a room the doctor had converted for longer-term patients, Lucas visited her every day. He brought her books from the general store, fresh fruit when he could find it, and most importantly, conversation that distracted her from her losses. He learned that she loved poetry, that she had once dreamed of becoming a teacher, that she could speak a little Spanish and French. She learned that he had come to Arizona from Texas 5 years earlier, that he was 24 years old, that he had lost his own family to cholera when he was 16, and understood something of the grief she carried. The day Dr. Thompson finally removed the last of her bandages, Catherine stood in front of a mirror for the first time since the fire. Lucas had been asked to wait outside, but he heard her sharp intake of breath and the doctor's low, comforting murmur. When she emerged, her arms were wrapped protectively around herself, and she would not meet his eyes. The burns had healed but left their mark. Thick, raised scars covered her arms from wrist to shoulder, visible even beneath the long-sleeved dress the church women had donated. More scars traced up her neck and onto her jaw on the left side, while her hands bore the mottled appearance of skin that had been burned and recovered. She was still beautiful, Lucas thought, but he could see in her eyes that she no longer believed it herself. The doctor says I can leave tomorrow, she said quietly, still not looking at him. But I have nowhere to go. The homestead is gone, and I have no money to speak of. Lucas had been thinking about this problem for days. The ranch owner's wife, Mrs. Patterson, has been looking for someone to help with the house. It is too much for her to manage alone now that they have expanded operations. Room and board plus a small wage. I already spoke to them about you, and they are willing to give you a chance if you are interested. Catherine's head snapped up, and for the first time in days, something like hope flickered in her expression. You would do that for me? Why, you do not even know me. I know enough, Lucas said simply. I know you are strong and capable, and that you deserve a chance to rebuild your life. Everyone needs help sometimes. Let me help you now. The Patterson Ranch sprawled across thousands of acres of Arizona desert and scrubland, with the main house a solid adobe structure that stayed cool even in the brutal summer heat. Mrs. Patterson was a kind woman in her 50s who took one look at Catherine and immediately embraced her like a daughter, scars and all. Her husband, James Patterson, was equally welcoming, and within a day, Catherine had moved into a small but comfortable room off the kitchen and begun her new life. Lucas lived in the bunkhouse with the other ranch hands, but he found excuses to visit the main house far more often than he had before Catherine's arrival. He would bring vegetables from the kitchen garden, ask Mrs. Patterson questions about supplies, or offer to repair things that did not strictly need repairing. Catherine noticed, of course, and despite her grief and self-consciousness about her appearance, she found herself watching for his visits, listening for his voice, feeling a lightness in her chest when he appeared. 3 months after the fire, on a warm October evening, Lucas finally worked up the courage to ask Catherine to walk with him after dinner. They strolled past the corrals where horses dozed in the fading light, past the barn where swallows nested in the rafters, out to a small rise that overlooked the valley. The sunset painted the sky in shades of pink and gold, and the air smelled of sage and desert flowers. "How are you settling in?" Lucas asked, though he knew the answer. He had watched her blossom under Mrs. Patterson's gentle care, had seen her smile return gradually like a sun emerging from behind clouds. "Better than I could have hoped," Catherine admitted. "Mrs. Patterson is wonderful and the work keeps my mind occupied. I still think about my parents every day, but the pain is less sharp now. More of an ache than a wound, if that makes sense." "It does," Lucas said quietly. "That is how grief works. It never entirely leaves, but it becomes something you can carry instead of something that carries you." They walked in comfortable silence for a while, until Catherine suddenly stopped and turned to face him. Her expression was serious, almost nervous, and she was worrying her scarred hands together in a gesture he had come to recognize as a sign of her anxiety. "Lucas, I need to say something," she began, her voice trembling slightly. "You have been so kind to me, visiting nearly every day, checking on my well-being, treating me as though I am still the same person I was before the fire. But I need you to understand something." She took a deep breath and began slowly rolling up the sleeves of her dress, revealing the full extent of the scars that covered her arms. Then she unfastened the top buttons of her collar and pulled the fabric aside to show the scarring that extended down her shoulders and chest. In the golden light of the setting sun, the scars stood out starkly against her skin, a permanent reminder of the worst night of her life. "I have scars everywhere," she revealed nervously, her voice breaking on the words. "Not just what you can see, but all across my back, down my legs. I am not who I was before. I am marked, damaged. And I do not want you to feel obligated to continue your kindness out of pity or guilt. You saved my life, and I will be forever grateful, but you do not owe me anything more than that." Lucas felt his heart clench at the pain and vulnerability in her voice. He stepped closer, and slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wished, he reached out and took her hands in his. Then, with infinite gentleness, he traced the scars on her arms with his fingertips, following their paths from her wrists to her elbows, up to her shoulders, along her neck. "Each one makes you more uniquely beautiful," he said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "Catherine, these scars are not damage. They are proof that you survived. They show your strength, your will to live. When I look at you, I do not see something broken. I see the bravest woman I have ever known." Tears spilled down Catherine's cheeks, but for the first time since the fire, they were not tears of grief or shame. "Do you truly mean that?" she whispered. "I have never meant anything more in my life," Lucas replied, cupping her face gently in his hands. "I have been trying to find the courage to tell you that I have fallen in love with you. Not despite these scars, but with all of you, scars included. They are part of your story now, and I want to be part of that story too, if you will let me." Catherine's response was to rise on her toes and kiss him, her scarred hands coming up to tangle in his hair as he wrapped his arms around her and held her close. The kiss was gentle at first, tentative, then deeper as weeks of building emotion finally found their release. When they finally pulled apart, both were breathless and smiling through tears. "I was so afraid," Catherine admitted, resting her forehead against his chest. afraid that no one would ever want me again, that I would spend the rest of my life alone because of how I look now. Then let me spend the rest of my life proving you wrong, Lucas murmured into her hair. Let me show you every day how beautiful you are to me. They stood wrapped in each other's arms as the sun sank below the horizon and the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. In the distance, they could hear the sounds of the ranch settling down for the night, horses whinnying, the cook ringing the dinner bell for the hands. The peaceful sounds of a life Catherine was beginning to believe she might be able to build again. Their courtship after that evening was conducted under the watchful but approving eyes of the Pattersons. Lucas would wait for Catherine to finish her morning chores, and they would take breakfast together at the kitchen table while Mrs. Patterson pretended not to notice the way they looked at each other. In the evenings, after Lucas had completed his own work for the day, they would walk together, sometimes talking for hours about everything and nothing, other times simply enjoying each other's presence in comfortable silence. Lucas was patient with Catherine's remaining insecurities about her appearance. On days when the scars seemed to bother her more than usual, when she caught sight of herself in a mirror and flinched, he would find small ways to remind her that she was loved. He would kiss her scarred hands, trace the marks on her neck with gentle fingers, tell her stories of moments when he had been struck anew by her beauty. Gradually, painfully, Catherine began to believe him. Winter came to the Arizona desert, bringing cooler temperatures and occasional rain that turned the normally brown landscape briefly green. Catherine celebrated her 21st birthday in December with a small party that Mrs. Patterson organized, complete with a cake and gifts from the ranch hands who had all come to respect and care for the quiet young woman with the scarred arms and kind heart. Lucas gave her a leather-bound journal and a fountain pen, knowing her love of writing. "For recording the new stories," he said as she unwrapped it, her eyes going wide with delight. "All the good things that are still to come." On Christmas Eve, as they stood together under a sky brilliant with stars, Lucas took both of Catherine's hands in his and dropped to one knee in the dust. "Catherine Andrews, I know it has only been a few months since that terrible night when I first met you," he began, his voice steady despite the emotion she could see in his eyes. "But I have never been more certain of anything than I am of my love for you. You are the strongest, kindest, most beautiful woman I have ever known, and I want to spend the rest of my life proving that to you every single day. Will you marry me?" Catherine's hands flew to her mouth as tears streamed down her face. "Yes," she managed to choke out. "Yes, Lucas, of course I will marry you." The ring he slipped onto her scarred finger was simple, a thin gold band with a small stone that caught the starlight, but to Catherine, it was the most precious thing she had ever owned. They married in February of 1879 in a simple ceremony at the church in Coolidge, with Mrs. Patterson crying happy tears and Mr. Patterson standing as a witness alongside several of the ranch hands. Catherine wore a cream-colored dress that Mrs. Patterson had helped her sew, with long sleeves and a high collar that covered most of her scars, though Lucas had told her repeatedly that she should wear whatever made her most comfortable. The Pattersons had offered them a small cottage on the ranch property as a wedding gift, an adobe structure with 2 rooms and a covered porch that had previously been used for storage. Lucas and several of the other hands had spent weeks fixing it up, repairing the roof, installing new windows, building furniture. Catherine had sewn curtains and planted a small garden, and by the time they moved in as husband and wife, it felt like a true home. Their first year of marriage was not without challenges. Catherine still had nightmares about the fire, waking in the dark crying out for her parents, her body rigid with remembered terror. Lucas would hold her through these episodes, stroking her hair and murmuring reassurances until her breathing calmed and she could sleep again. She learned his own nightmares too, the memories he carried of losing his family, of being alone at 16 in a harsh world. They healed each other slowly, with patience and love and the understanding that came from shared experience of loss. Catherine continued to work for Mrs. Patterson, though now it was more as a companion and assistant than a servant. She helped with the household accounts, planned menus, oversaw the kitchen garden that she had expanded considerably. Lucas took on more responsibilities as well, and Mr. Patterson began talking about eventually making him a partner in the ranch operations. Life settled into a rhythm that felt sustainable, even joyful. In the summer of their first year of marriage, Catherine realized she was pregnant. She told Lucas one evening as they sat on their porch watching the sun set, his hand immediately going to her still flat stomach with wonder and a touch of fear in his eyes. "Are you frightened?" he asked quietly. "Terrified," Catherine admitted with a shaky laugh, "but also happy, excited. This baby will be the first member of a new family, one we are creating together. Our parents would have loved that." "They would have loved you," Lucas said, pulling her close. "Just as I love you, just as this child will love you." The pregnancy progressed normally, though Catherine's anxiety about childbirth was compounded by her fear that her scars might somehow affect the baby. Dr. Thompson, who had become a good friend over the months, reassured her repeatedly that the burns had been external and would have no impact on her ability to carry or deliver a healthy child. Still, Catherine worried, and Lucas spent many evenings with his hand on her growing belly, talking to the baby and telling Catherine stories to distract her from her fears. Their son was born in March of 1880, arriving after a labor that lasted nearly 20 hours and left Catherine exhausted but triumphant. Lucas, who had refused to leave her side despite the doctor's suggestions that he might be more comfortable waiting elsewhere, cut the umbilical cord with shaking hands and cried openly as he held his son for the first time. They named him James, after Mr. Patterson, with the middle name Thomas after Catherine's father. He was a healthy baby with dark hair like his mother, and what would eventually become his father's blue-gray eyes. Catherine, despite her fears about her scarred appearance frightening or somehow marking her child, proved to be a natural mother, and Lucas fell even more deeply in love with her watching her nurse and care for their son. The Pattersons were overjoyed with the new addition to their extended ranch family, and Mrs. Patterson in particular spent hours holding baby James and telling Catherine stories about her own children, who were grown and living back east. The other ranch hands treated the baby like a collective nephew, taking turns whittling toys and teaching him to recognize horse sounds before he could even sit up properly. As James grew from infant to toddler, Catherine found herself slowly letting go of the last remnants of shame about her scars. It was impossible to hide them from a curious child, and when James began touching them and asking questions in his limited vocabulary, she found herself explaining them simply as marks from a fire, proof that his mother was strong. Lucas would often find them together, James tracing the scars on Catherine's arms while she told him stories, and his heart would swell with love for both of them. When James was 2 years old, Mr. Patterson called Lucas into his office and made him the offer they had both been anticipating for some time. He wanted to sell Lucas a portion of the ranch, making him a true partner rather than simply a foreman. The price was more than fair, structured so that Lucas could pay it off over time from his share of the ranch profits. Lucas and Catherine discussed it long into the night, weighing the responsibility against the opportunity, before finally accepting. The partnership changed their status in the community. They were no longer simply ranch employees, but landowners, members of the small but growing class of people building permanent lives in Arizona territory. Catherine found herself invited to ladies' socials and church committees, and while she was initially hesitant, worried about how her scars would be received, she discovered that most people were far more interested in her opinions and contributions than in her appearance. There were a few who stared or whispered, but Lucas had taught her to hold her head high and remember her own worth. In 1883, Catherine gave birth to their second child, a daughter they named Elizabeth after Lucas's mother. The labor was easier this time, and Catherine recovered quickly, eager to return to managing her household and helping with the expanding ranch operations. Elizabeth proved to have her mother's green eyes and her father's stubbornness, and from the moment she could crawl, she followed her older brother everywhere. James was a gentle big brother, protective and patient with his little sister. Lucas would often find them playing together in the yard, James carefully making sure Elizabeth did not get too close to the horses or wander too far from the house. Catherine would watch them from the porch, her hand unconsciously tracing the scars on her arms, marveling at how her life had transformed from that terrible night 5 years earlier. The ranch prospered under Lucas and Mr. Patterson's joint management. They expanded their cattle operation and began breeding horses, developing a reputation for quality animals that brought buyers from as far away as California. Catherine took over more of the business record keeping, discovering she had a natural aptitude for numbers and organization. In the evenings, after the children were in bed, she and Lucas would sit together going over accounts and planning future investments, partners in every sense of the word. In 1885, tragedy struck when Mr. Patterson died suddenly of a heart attack while out checking on the herds. The loss devastated everyone who knew him, but especially Mrs. Patterson, who had been married to him for over 30 years. Catherine moved her into the main house and spent weeks helping her navigate her grief, drawing on her own experience of sudden, terrible loss. Lucas took over full management of the ranch, working closely with Mrs. Patterson to ensure her husband's legacy continued. Mrs. Patterson surprised everyone by announcing that she wanted to sign over her share of the ranch to Lucas and Catherine, keeping only a lifetime right to live in the main house and a small income from the profits. She said her children had no interest in ranching, and she wanted the land to go to people who loved it and would care for it properly. Lucas tried to refuse, saying it was too much, but Mrs. Patterson was adamant. The papers were signed in the fall of 1885, making Lucas and Catherine full owners of what was now called the Prescott Ranch. The responsibility was enormous, but also deeply fulfilling. Lucas hired more hands and invested in better equipment and breeding stock. Catherine expanded the kitchen garden into a full vegetable operation, selling produce to other ranches and the growing town of Coolidge. She also began teaching children to read and write 2 afternoons a week in the ranch house parlor, fulfilling the dream of becoming a teacher that she had thought died in the fire. James started helping with ranch chores as soon as he was old enough, showing a natural way with horses that delighted his father. Elizabeth proved to have her mother's love of learning and could often be found curled up with a book in whatever quiet corner she could find. Catherine would watch her children growing strong and confident, and sometimes still could not quite believe this was her life. The scars never entirely faded, of course. They remained a permanent part of Catherine's body, sometimes aching in cold weather, always visible when she wore anything but the most concealing clothes. But their meaning had changed over the years. What had once seemed like disfigurement now felt more like a map of her journey, marking the path from the girl she had been to the woman she had become. Lucas never stopped telling her she was beautiful. Even after years of marriage, he would trace her scars with gentle fingers and tell her they made her more precious to him, not less. Catherine had long since stopped flinching when he touched them, had learned to accept his words as truth rather than empty comfort. She had become comfortable enough with her appearance to wear shorter sleeves in the summer heat, to pull her hair back instead of always hiding behind it, to meet the eyes of anyone who stared and hold her head high. In 1887, when Catherine was 29 and Lucas was 33, they welcomed their third child, another son they named Thomas after Catherine's father. By this point, the ranch was thriving, supporting not just their family but also Mrs. Patterson, 3 permanent ranch hands and several seasonal workers. They had built a larger house to accommodate their growing family, though they kept the cottage where they had first lived as newlyweds for guests and overflow. James was now 7 and already talking about how he would run the ranch someday, while Elizabeth at 4 was beginning to learn her letters and numbers from her mother. Thomas was a happy baby who seemed content to be passed between family members, smiling at everyone who held him. Catherine would sometimes stand on the porch of their home, baby in her arms, watching Lucas work with James and the horses, Elizabeth playing in her garden, and feel such overwhelming gratitude that tears would spring to her eyes. Life was not perfect, of course. There were years of drought that tested their water resources and forced difficult decisions about the herds. There were cattle rustlers who had to be chased off and occasionally dealt with more firmly. Elizabeth fell from a horse when she was 6 and broke her arm, sending Catherine into a panic that took days to fully subside. James came down with scarlet fever at 8, and for a terrifying week, they thought they might lose him before the fever finally broke and he began the slow road to recovery. Through all of it, Lucas and Catherine faced challenges together, drawing strength from each other and from the family they had built. Mrs. Patterson remained a beloved presence in their lives until she passed peacefully in her sleep in 1889, leaving behind a letter for Catherine expressing how much joy it had given her to watch Catherine transform from the frightened, burned girl Dr. Thompson brought to the ranch into the confident, capable woman she had become. The children grew and thrived. James became an expert horseman and took over more and more of the daily ranch operations as he entered his teenage years. Elizabeth developed a passion for teaching and began helping her mother with the reading classes, showing a patience and skill with younger children that promised a bright future. Thomas proved to be the most adventurous of the 3, always exploring, always asking questions, always finding new ways to worry his parents with his fearless curiosity. In 1892, when Catherine was 34, she surprised everyone including herself by becoming pregnant again with their 4th child. James was 12, Elizabeth 9, and Thomas 5, and Catherine had assumed her childbearing years were behind her. But Lucas was delighted, and the children were excited about having another sibling, so Catherine embraced this unexpected blessing. Their second daughter was born in early 1893, and they named her Sarah after Lucas's grandmother. She had her mother's dark hair and her father's blue-gray eyes, and from the beginning, she seemed to bring a special light into their home. James, now nearly 13 and trying hard to be grown up, was surprisingly tender with his baby sister. Elizabeth, at 10, appointed herself as Sarah's primary caretaker whenever their mother needed a break. Thomas, who had been the baby for 5 years, adjusted to his new role with good humor. The years flowed by with the inevitable passage of time. each season bringing its own rhythms and challenges and joys. Lucas began teaching James the full scope of ranch management, knowing that someday the boy would indeed take over the operation. Elizabeth announced at 12 that she wanted to become a real teacher and began studying everything she could about education and pedagogy. Thomas continued to be their wild one, but his adventurous spirit was tempered by a good heart and genuine kindness. Sarah grew into a sweet-natured child who loved music and could often be heard singing as she went about her chores. Catherine taught her to play the piano they had bought in 1890, and the house was frequently filled with the sound of Sarah practicing scales and simple songs. In 1896, James turned 16 and began courting a girl from a neighboring ranch, bringing her to Sunday dinners where Catherine and Lucas could barely hide their amusement at their son's obvious nerves. Elizabeth, at 13, had already been approached by several families about becoming a governess for their children, though Catherine and Lucas insisted she finish her own education first. Thomas at 9 was finally starting to settle down slightly, though he still kept them on their toes. Sarah at 3 was everyone's darling, charming the ranch hands and visitors alike with her bright smile and cheerful disposition. Lucas, now 42, had streaks of gray in his hair and lines around his eyes from years of squinting in the desert sun, but Catherine thought he had only become more handsome with age. He still looked at her with the same love and devotion he had shown that evening when he first traced her scars and called them beautiful, and she still felt her heart skip when he walked into a room. Catherine herself was 38, her dark hair showing its own touches of gray, her scars long since faded from angry red to pale silver lines that mapped her arms and shoulders and back. She moved with confidence now, secure in her place in the world and in her husband's love, comfortable with the woman she had become. The young girl who had been so ashamed of her burns seemed like someone from another lifetime. They celebrated their 17th wedding anniversary in February of 1896 with a dinner prepared by their children, who shooed them out of the kitchen and managed to produce a reasonably edible meal with only minor disasters. After dinner, Lucas took Catherine's hand and led her outside to the porch, where they sat together watching the sun set over land that was truly theirs. "You ever think about that night?" Lucas asked quietly, his arm around her shoulders. "The fire." Catherine was silent for a moment, considering. "Sometimes," she admitted. "Less than I used to. I think about my parents, of course, and wish they could have known their grandchildren. But the fire itself, the pain and fear that has faded. What I remember most now is you appearing through the smoke like an answer to a prayer I had not even finished praying. I remember thinking you were the bravest person I had ever seen," Lucas said. "Even half dead from burns and smoke, you were trying to save your parents. I knew right then you were someone special. You changed my life," Catherine said, turning to look at him. "You saved it, yes, but more than that, you showed me I was still worth loving even when I felt broken beyond repair. I do not know who I would have become without you." "You were always strong," Lucas replied. "I just helped you remember it, and you changed my life too, Catherine. Before I met you, I was just going through the motions, working and sleeping and working again. You gave me a reason to build something permanent, a family and a legacy. You gave me everything." They kissed then, a soft kiss that held 17 years of love and partnership and shared struggle and triumph. In the house behind them, they could hear their children laughing and arguing over who had to wash the dishes. In the corrals, horses whinnied their evening greetings. The desert stretched out around them, harsh and beautiful and home. In 1898, James married his sweetheart in a ceremony that drew families from all over the territory. Lucas signed over a portion of the ranch to his son as a wedding gift, and James and his new wife moved into the cottage where Lucas and Catherine had started their own married life. Catherine cried happy tears watching her son repeat his vows, remembering her own wedding day and how uncertain she had felt about the future. Now, looking at the confident young man James had become, she felt only pride and hope. Elizabeth, at 15, was already teaching full-time at a school that had opened in Coolidge, riding into town each morning and returning in the evening with stories about her students. She had inherited her mother's patience and her father's steady determination, and parents throughout the area specifically requested her as their children's teacher. Thomas, at 11, had announced his intention to become a horse breeder, focusing specifically on developing animals suited for the harsh Arizona climate. Lucas, remembering his own ambitions at that age, took his son seriously and began teaching him everything about bloodlines and breeding and training. Sarah, at 5, was still the baby of the family, though she had informed everyone that she was now too old for baby treatment and should be given more responsibilities. Catherine and Lucas, now in their early 40s, had reached a stage of life where the hardest physical work of building the ranch was behind them. They could afford to hire help for the most demanding tasks, allowing them to focus on management and planning and spending time with their growing family. They took long walks in the evenings, discussing the day and making plans for the future, comfortable in the partnership they had built over nearly 2 decades together. The new century arrived with celebrations throughout Arizona territory. The Prescotts hosted a large party at the ranch, inviting neighbors and friends from throughout the region. As midnight approached on December 31, 1899, Catherine stood surrounded by her family, Lucas's arm around her waist, her children and daughter-in-law close by, and felt a profound sense of gratitude for the life she had been given. When the clock struck 12 and everyone cheered and embraced, Lucas pulled Catherine aside and kissed her deeply, unbothered by the audience. "Here is to the new century," he murmured against her lips, "and to spending every day of it loving you." "Every single day," Catherine agreed, her scarred hands coming up to cup his face. "For as long as we both shall live." In 1901, James and his wife welcomed their first child, making Lucas and Catherine grandparents at 47 and 43 respectively. The baby, a girl they named Catherine after her grandmother, was the image of James's wife but had the blue-gray Prescott eyes. Catherine the younger held her namesake with tears streaming down her face, marveling at the continuation of the family line she and Lucas had created together. Elizabeth became engaged to a teacher from Phoenix, a kind young man who respected her intelligence and supported her passion for education. They planned to marry in the fall of 1902 and start a school together in one of the newer settlements northwest of Coolidge. Thomas, at 14, was already showing remarkable skill with horses, and Lucas began seriously considering expanding into horse breeding as their primary business. Sarah, at 8, had decided she wanted to be a writer and filled notebook after notebook with stories and observations. Life continued its steady progression through joys and sorrows, triumphs and challenges. There were years of good rain and abundant grass, and years of drought that tested their reserves. There were births and deaths, weddings and funerals, the normal cycle of frontier life. Through it all, Lucas and Catherine remained each other's constants, the partnership they had forged in the aftermath of tragedy proving strong enough to weather whatever came their way. On their 25th wedding anniversary, in February of 1904, their children organized a celebration that brought people from all over the territory. The ranch house was packed with friends and family, music and laughter filling rooms that had been built on the foundation of two people who had found each other in the darkest of times and chosen to build something beautiful together. During the party, Lucas stood to give a toast, and the room fell silent to hear him speak. 25 years ago, he began, his voice carrying easily across the crowded room, I met a young woman on the worst night of her life. She had just lost everything, and she was badly burned in terrible pain. But even then, I could see her strength, her will to survive. I saved her life that night, it is true, but she saved mine right back by teaching me what real courage looks like. He turned to Catherine, who was seated beside him, tears already streaming down her face. You were afraid no one would ever love you because of your scars, he continued, his voice thick with emotion. But I fell in love with you not despite those scars, but with all of you, including them. They are part of your story, part of what made you the incredible woman you are today, and I would not change a single thing about you. Catherine stood and embraced him as the room erupted in applause and cheers. Against his chest, she whispered, You kept your promise. You showed me every single day that I was beautiful to you. Thank you for never giving up on me, even when I had given up on myself. I could never give up on you, Lucas replied. You are my heart, Catherine. You always have been. The party continued late into the night, but eventually the guests departed, and their children went to their own homes, leaving Lucas and Catherine alone in the house that had seen so much life and love. They walked out onto the porch as they had done thousands of times over the years, and stood looking up at the stars that blazed in the desert sky. I have been thinking, Catherine said quietly, about that girl I was, trapped under that beam, certain she was going to die. If I could go back and tell her what was waiting for her, all the love and family and happiness, I wonder if she would believe me. She would, Lucas said with certainty, because she was already brave enough to survive. She just needed someone to remind her that surviving was only the beginning, that there was still so much life left to live. You did more than remind me, Catherine said. You gave me a reason to want to live, to build a future. You saw me when I felt invisible, loved me when I felt unlovable. Everything good in my life traces back to you. And everything good in mine traces back to you, Lucas countered. We saved each other, Catherine. That is what love does. They stood in comfortable silence, Catherine leaning against Lucas's chest, his arms wrapped around her, her scarred hands resting on top of his. The scars that had once seemed like such a terrible burden now felt like just another part of her, no more significant than the gray in her hair or the lines on her face. They were evidence of what she had survived, yes, but more importantly, they were evidence of what she had built in the aftermath. In 1906, Thomas married a young woman he had met at a horse auction, and they settled on another portion of the ranch that Lucas divided off for him. Sarah, at 13, had begun submitting her stories to newspapers and magazines, and to everyone's delight, several had been published. James and his wife had welcomed 2 more children, giving Lucas and Catherine 3 grandchildren to spoil. Elizabeth and her husband had successfully established their school and were making a real difference in their community. Lucas and Catherine, now 52 and 48, had reached a stage of life where they could step back from daily ranch operations and let their children carry more of the responsibility. They traveled occasionally, visiting Elizabeth in her new town, spending time with each of their children and the growing collection of grandchildren. But they always returned to the ranch, to the land they had built their life upon, to the home that held so many memories. On a warm evening in the spring of 1908, 30 years after the fire that had changed Catherine's life forever, she and Lucas sat on their porch watching the sunset. Catherine was 50, her hair now more gray than dark, her face lined with the marks of a life well lived. Lucas was 54, his hair silver, his body still strong from years of ranch work. They held hands, fingers intertwined, as comfortable with each other as two people could be after nearly 3 decades together. "I was thinking today about something Mrs. Patterson said to me once," Catherine mused. "It was not long after I started working for her, and I was still so self-conscious about my scars. I made some comment about being damaged, and she looked at me very seriously and said that broken things that heal become stronger at the break. I did not believe her then, but I think I understand now what she meant. The fire broke you," Lucas said softly. "But you healed, and in healing you became stronger than you ever could have been without surviving that tragedy. Your scars are not weakness, Catherine. They never were." "I know that now," she replied. "It took me years to truly believe it, but I know it. And I know that I never could have healed the way I did without you. You loved me when I could not love myself, and that made all the difference." Lucas brought her scarred hand to his lips and kissed it gently, just as he had done countless times over the years. "Loving you has been the greatest privilege of my life," he said. "Every single day with you has been a gift." As the sun sank below the horizon and the stars began to emerge, Catherine reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. She thought about the terrified young woman trapped in a burning barn, certain her life was over. She thought about the kind cowboy who had pulled her from the flames and then refused to let her give up on herself. She thought about learning to live with scars that had seemed unbearable at first, but had become simply part of who she was. Most of all, she thought about love, the transformative power of being truly seen and accepted by another person. Lucas had traced her scars and called them beautiful, and in doing so, he had given her permission to believe she could still have a full life, still be worthy of love and happiness. That gift had made everything else possible. Their children had grown and started families of their own. Their ranch had prospered and expanded. They had built a legacy that would continue long after they were gone. But none of it would have happened without that moment when Lucas looked at her damaged skin and saw not something to pity or fix, but simply her, beautiful and whole and deserving of love. "What are you thinking about?" Lucas asked, noticing the contemplative expression on her face. "Everything," Catherine replied with a soft smile. "Our whole life together. How strange and wonderful it is that the worst night of my life led directly to the best parts of it. How you taught me that scars do not define us, that we are so much more than the worst things that have happened to us." "You taught me that too," Lucas said. "You showed me that strength is not about never breaking, but about healing and continuing forward even after you have been broken. You are the strongest person I know, Catherine Prescott." They sat together as darkness fell completely, and the desert came alive with its nighttime sounds. In the distance, they could hear cattle lowing and horses shifting in their stalls. Closer, they heard the creak of the porch swing and the rustle of wind through the sage. These were the sounds of home, of a life built through love and persistence, and the refusal to let tragedy have the final word. The scars on Catherine's arms and shoulders caught the moonlight, shining silver against her skin. Once, they had made her want to hide, to cover herself and disappear from sight. Now, they were simply part of her story, chapters written in scar tissue that told of survival and strength, and the incredible capacity of the human spirit to heal and grow beyond trauma. Lucas traced those scars now, his touch as gentle and reverent as it had been the first time he told her. They made her beautiful. Catherine smiled and leaned into his embrace, secure in the knowledge that she was loved completely, scars and all. This was the life she had built from the ashes of tragedy, and it was more beautiful than anything she could have imagined that terrible night 30 years ago. Their love story had begun in fire and pain, but it had blossomed into something remarkable, something that had created a family and a legacy that would endure for generations. And at the heart of it all was a simple truth that Lucas had spoken to her on that long-ago evening when she first showed him her scars. They made her uniquely beautiful, every single one of them, because they were part of what made her who she was. As they sat together under the stars, Catherine realized that this was what healing looked like. Not the absence of scars, but the presence of love strong enough to make those scars irrelevant. Not forgetting the pain, but building something so beautiful in its aftermath that the pain became just one chapter in a much larger story. Not being unchanged by tragedy, but choosing what kind of change would result from it. She had chosen love. She had chosen life. And with Lucas by her side, she had built a future that honored the past without being trapped by it. The girl who had been pulled from that burning barn had become a woman of strength and grace, a mother and grandmother, a partner and friend. The scars remained, but they no longer defined her. They were simply evidence of everything she had survived and overcome. "I love you," Catherine said softly, the words as true now as they had been the first time she spoke them nearly 30 years ago. "I love you," Lucas replied, pulling her closer. "Every beautiful, scarred inch of you. Today, tomorrow, and for the rest of our lives." And there, on the porch of the home they had built together, under a sky full of stars, Catherine and Lucas Prescott sat wrapped in each other's arms, living proof that love could heal even the deepest wounds, and that scars could be transformed from marks of shame into badges of honor. Their story, which had begun in the flames of tragedy, had become a testament to the power of love to redeem, restore, and make all things beautiful in its own time.